She was 58 years old, and on the morning the bank posted its final notice on the door of the only home she had known for 30 years. She stood in the frost-hard yard with nothing but a shawl around her shoulders and a small purse containing $9.40. It was Cyrus Bell, president of the Merrill County Trust, who had called in the note her late husband had taken against the farm 3 winters before his death, a debt she had not known existed until the letter arrived, and who informed her with practiced regret that the law offered her no recourse and the calendar offered her no mercy. She had a trunk of quilts, a locket that belonged to her mother, and $9.40. And with that she walked into the town of Hollow Pine, Montana Territory, and found, at the edge of the frozen river, a collapsed ice house that the old ice company had abandoned when the railroad made ice cheaper to ship than to cut, a builder with a caved roof and a door hanging by one hinge, and she paid the last owner $4 for it, all she could spare, because it was the only roof left in the world that anyone would sell her. The men at the feed store laughed when they heard. Said a widow had bought herself a tomb of sawdust and rot, good for nothing but a slow freeze come January. But sealed beneath the packed sawdust and river ice that had never fully thawed in that broken building was something that had waited a light years to be found, something that would not only save one forgotten woman, but would return to an entire town a piece of its history believed lost forever beneath the ice. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Constance Whitfield. If you have ever been told that what you were left with was worthless, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Constance Mabry, as she was born in 1834, grew up on the banks of the Missouri River in a family that made its modest living harvesting ice in the deep of winter and selling it to the long Dakota summers. A trader father, Ezekiel Mabry, had learned from his own father before him and practiced with craftsman's exacting patience. Ezekiel was not a wealthy man, but he was a respected one, known up and down the river for quality of his ice, cut in even, heavy blocks from the clearest parts of the river, where the current ran slow and the freeze went deep and clean, packed in sawdust and ice houses built with a care that other men in the trade considered excessive. He used to tell Constance, as she rode beside him on the sledge hauling blocks up from the cutting grounds, that ice was a strange kind of wealth because it demanded honesty of the man who kept it. A poorly built ice house would tell on its owner by summer, its ice gone to slush and waste, while a well-built one will hold its cold faithfully through the hottest months, a slow, patient proof that care given in winter was repaid in July. Nothing in this trade rewards shortcuts, he told her more than once. Packing sawdust into the walls of a new ice house with his bare, cracked hands, the cold only forgives a patient. Her mother, Ruth Mabry, had come from a family of millers and brought to the household a different kind of exactitude, teaching Constance to keep books, to weigh and measure and record with precision that many considered unusual for a girl in a river trade family, and understand that a business built on trust with one's neighbors was worth more across a lifetime than any single season's profit taken by shorting a customer's weight. It was from her mother that Constance learned to read a ledger the way another woman might read a face, understanding that the numbers told a story about who a person truly was when no one else was watching them close the account. Constance grew into a young woman capable with her hands and her figures both, unafraid of the brutal cold of a winter harvest, and possessed of her father's quiet belief that patience and honest labor were their own kind of inheritance, more durable than any coin. She met Thaddeus Whitfield in 1856, a carpenter and sometime river pilot who had come up from St. Louis seeking work on the new steamboat landings being built along the upper Missouri, a broad-shouldered, gentle-spoken man who admired. He told her plainly during their courtship that she never seemed to believe cold, hard labor beneath a woman's dignity, and who matched her own patience with a steadiness of his own. They married in the autumn of 1857 and moved west together 3 years later, in 1860, following rumors of a new settlement forming around a river crossing that would become the town of Hollow Pine, in what was then still raw and largely unclaimed territory, drawn by the promise of good timber, a reliable river, and land cheap enough that a young couple with strong backs and careful habits might build something lasting. Thaddeus took up carpentry and helped raise half the frame buildings that would eventually make up Hollow Pine's Main Street, while Constance, drawing on her father's trade, helped establish the town's first proper ice house down by the river bend, a modest operation that supplied the growing settlement's few businesses with ice through the brutal high summer months when the territory baked under a merciless sun. It was through this early ice house work that Constance came to know old Bartholomew Kessler, a gruff, taciturn Prussian immigrant who had staked a claim near the river crossing years before anyone else thought to settle there, a man who kept mostly to himself but who had, in the town's earliest and most desperate winter of 1862, quietly loaned seed grain and salted meat to nearly a dozen families who would otherwise have starved before spring, asking nothing in return but that they not speak of it, a condition most of them honored out of a kind of embarrassed gratitude. Constance had learned this only because her own family had been one of the dozen, and because old Kessler, in one of the rare unguarded moments of their long acquaintance, had told her, while they worked together packing a fresh Icehouse one bitter January, that a man ought to keep his good deeds as quiet as his sins, since either one spoken too loudly tended to curdle into something it was never meant to be. She never forgot the strangeness of that sentiment, nor the particular, careful way he said it, as though the words themselves cost him something. Constance and Thaddeus built a modest but contented life together over the following decade, raising no children who survived past infancy, a private grief the two of them carried together in the particular silent partnership of people who understand loss without needing to name it aloud, and pouring their unspent affection instead into the town itself, into the ice business that Constance came to run largely on her own once Thaddeus's carpentry work grew steady enough to occupy most of his hours, and into the quiet, unremarkable kindnesses that make up the true fabric of a small frontier settlement, mending harnesses, sitting with the sick, extending credit through hard winters to families who could not always pay it back in the same season. Thaddeus died of pneumonia in the terrible winter of 1885, a death that came on so suddenly, from a chest cold that seemed at first no worse than any other, that Constance barely had time to send for the doctor in the neighboring county before it was over, and she was left, at 51 years old, a widow with a modest Icehouse business, a paid-off home, and a grief she resolved, in her father's old fashion, to carry with patience rather than display. She might have continued that way indefinitely, running her small trade, keeping her own accounts, growing old in the house Thaddeus had built her with his own hands, had it not been for a debt she knew nothing about until it arrived on paper. Thaddeus, it emerged only after his death, had taken a loan against their home 3 years before he died, a sum borrowed quietly to help a struggling younger cousin back in St. Louis whom Constance had met only twice, a kindness he had never mentioned to her. Perhaps out of a husband's old-fashioned instinct to shield his wife from a worry he intended to resolve himself before she ever needed to know of it. He had been making the payments faithfully from his carpentry earnings, a fact Constance discovered only when those payments abruptly stopped with his death in a note, held not by a sympathetic local lender, but by the Merrill County Trust under Cyrus Bell's brisk management, came due in full according to terms Constance had never seen and could not now afford to meet. Cyrus Bell was a man who had arrived in Hollow Pine only in the last 5 years, buying up notes and mortgages from an older, more forgiving country banker who had retired east, and who ran his business with an efficiency that left little room for the kind of patient forbearance the previous banker had extended to widows and hard-luck families alike. He informed Constance, not unkindly in his manner but entirely without warmth, that the note's terms were the note's terms regardless of circumstance, that he had his own obligations to the trust's shareholders in Helena, and that while he sympathized with her situation, sympathy did not alter a legal instrument duly signed and recorded. Constance spent the better part of a year attempting to negotiate some manner of extension, selling what ice-cutting equipment she could spare, taking in mending and washing to scrape together partial payments. But the debt had accrued interest faster than her small trade could match it, and in the bitter early spring of 1892, Cyrus Bell foreclosed on the house and the small Icehouse business both, giving her 30 days to vacate a home she had lived in for over 3 decades. She spent those 30 days doing what her mother had taught her to do with any account, however painful, which was to take an honest inventory rather than dwell on what could not be changed. What remained to her, when the 30 days ended, was a trunk of quilts she had made across the years, her mother's locket, a few small keepsakes of Thaddeus's carpentry tools that held no resale value to speak of, but that she could not bring herself to sell, and $9.40 in coin. The entirety of what remained after the debt had consumed everything else she and Thaddeus had built. She was 58 years old, without children, without a husband, and without any clear notion of where a woman in her circumstances was meant to go in a territory that offered few kindnesses to those who arrived in it with empty hands. It was while walking the frozen edge of the river one gray afternoon, turning over in her mind the scant possibilities left to her, that she came upon the old Hollow Pine Ice Company's original Icehouse, a building she had known well in her younger years as a rival. Smaller operation to the one she and Thaddeus had eventually come to run themselves, a business that had folded a decade before when the new railroad spur made it cheaper to ship manufactured ice in from Butte than to cut and store. The natural kind. The building has stood empty and neglected ever since. Its roof partially collapsed under the weight of one too many heavy snows, its heavy timber door hanging loose on a single rusted hinge. Its interior packed still with old sawdust gone black with age and damp, a structure the town regarded, when it regarded at all, as an eyesore awaiting eventual demolition that no one had yet found the money or motivation to undertake. She found the building's current owner, a distracted merchant named Otto Prieger, who had inherited it along with several other unprofitable parcels from an uncle's estate and who had long wished to simply be rid of it, and she offered him $4, all she felt she could safely part with, for the structure and the small plot of riverside land beneath it. Prieger, delighted to shed a liability that cost him more in occasional vandalism complaints than it was worth, accepted without hesitation, and helped her draw up a simple bill of sale at the counter of his mercantile. Word of the purchase moved through Hollow Pine with particular speed such stories always seemed to travel, and the reaction was much as she had expected. The men who gathered at the feed store each morning remarked, loudly enough to be certain she would hear secondhand, if not directly, that Whitfield's widow had traded her last coin for a rotting ice house that would collapse entirely on her the first hard frost. And several of the women who had once sat beside her at church suppers now regarded her with a pitying discomfort that was, in its own way, more painful than open mockery. What she found when she began the work of clearing the ruin in the first days of ownership was a structure whose collapse had been more cosmetic than complete. For the ice house's double walls, built decades before according to old Kessler's exacting standards by men who had learned to trade the same patient way Constance's own father had taught her, remained largely sound beneath the damaged roofline. The thick sawdust insulation pack between inner and outer log walls having done exactly the job it was built to do even through years of neglect. She worked through the bitter early spring days clearing rotted roof timbers, salvaging what sound lumber she could, and shoveling out the old blackened sawdust that had insulated the building's floor for decades, and it was on the sixth day of this labor, while clearing sawdust from the deepest corner of the icehouse floor near its northern wall, that her shovel struck something with a dull, resistant thud entirely unlike the give of packed sawdust or river gravel. She knelt in the cold and worked more carefully with her bare hands, and found, still half encased in a slab of ancient river ice that had never fully melted in the building's deep, insulated cold even across a decade of neglect, the unmistakable shape of a sealed metal strongbox, its edges softened by frost, buried at the very bottom of the old ice pit, where the coldest layer had always been kept for the harshest days of summer trade. Her hands trembled as she worked the ice away from its edges with the flat of a hatchet and the patient warmth of her own breath, not from fear but from a particular fluttering recognition of a woman who understood she had stumbled upon something meant to remain hidden. And when the box finally came free of its ancient icy grave, she carried it out into the pale spring daylight and sat with it on an overturned crate, her breath visible in the cold air, working at a lock gone soft with rust, until it yielded to a few careful minutes with a thin blade from Thaddeus's old toolkit. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept out the worst of the damp even to the ice's long embrace, she found a bundle of papers, brittle at the edges but largely legible, and beneath them, folded in a scrap of felt, a modest but genuine collection of gold coin, perhaps $70 worth, more money than Constance had held at one time in years. But it was the papers that held her attention as the light began to fail, and she read by the last of the day's gray glow, because she recognized, with slow and mounting astonishment, the careful, angular hand of old Bartholomew Kessler, the reclusive settler who had died some 8 years before, in 1884, leaving behind no known family and a small estate that had been quietly absorbed, in the absence of any heir, into the holdings of the very same Merrill County Trust that had just foreclosed on Constance's home. The papers were Kessler's private accounts, kept separately from any official record, and what they revealed, as Constance read deeper into that first night by a small salvage lamp, was that the old Prussian settler had spent decades quietly serving as an unofficial lender and refuge to Hollow Pine's earliest and most vulnerable families, not merely in that one hard winter of 1862 that Constance herself remembered, but continuously across more than 20 years, extending small loans of seed, stock, and hard currency to widows, new immigrants, and families ruined by drought or fever, asking for repayment only when a family could truly spare it, and forgiving debts outright when they could not. All of it recorded in a private ledger he had evidently kept buried beneath the ice for safekeeping, perhaps fearing, in his old immigrant's caution, banks and official record keepers more that he feared the cold. The ledger's final entries, dated in the months before his death, spoke of Kessler's growing alarm at the arrival of a new banker in town, a man he identified by name as Cyrus Bell, whom Kessler had come to suspect, through careful observation of the man's dealings with several struggling families, of deliberately calling in notes at the harshest possible moments, timing foreclosures to strip families of land and property just as spring planting or a new business venture might have saved them, and pocketing the resulting seized assets through a pattern of undervalued sales to buyers who Kessler's careful notes suggested were Bell's own quiet associates operating under other names. Kessler had begun, in his final months, compiling specific instances, names, dates, and sums, intending, his last entries made clear, to travel to the territorial capital and lay his findings before the banking commission there, a journey he never completed before illness took him suddenly in the winter of 1884, his private ledger and its damning evidence forgotten in the one place no one thought to search, the frozen depths of an abandoned icehouse. Constance sat with the ledger long after her small lamp had guttered low, understanding with a gravity that settled over her slowly and completely that she was holding proof of the very same scheme that had just claimed her own home, that the debt Thaddeus had taken, and the foreclosure that followed it were not, as she had believed, simple misfortune, but very possibly one instance among many of a pattern Cyrus Bell had practiced deliberately across the better part of a decade, and that the man, responsible for Hollow Pine's quiet decade of small, forgotten ruinations, was still very much alive, still respected, and still sitting behind the same desk from which he had signed the papers that took her home. She did not act rashly, holding to her father's old counsel that the cold only rewards a patient, and she spent the following days finishing the Icehouse's most urgent repairs, banking a small stove she had salvaged, and turning the discovery over in her mind with the same careful attention she had once given to a ledger of ice weights and summer sales. She resolved to learn, before doing anything else, exactly how many families in Hollow Pine might have been affected by whatever scheme Kessler had suspected, and it was old Prieger, the merchant who had sold her the Icehouse, who proved unexpectedly useful, for he remembered, once Constance asked him carefully and without revealing what she had found, no fewer than 5 families over the past decade who had lost land or business to sudden foreclosures under Bell's management, families who had since scattered to other counties or taken up as tenant laborers on land that had once been their own. Word of Constance's discovery, inevitably, began to move through Hollow Pine before she was fully ready for it, distorted quickly into vague rumors of buried treasure, until it reached, as such rumors always seem to, the ears of Cyrus Bell himself. He came to the Icehouse on a raw April afternoon, dressed in the fine dark coat he favored, and found Constance repairing a section of her roof, and he did not trouble himself with pleasantries, informing her plainly that whatever old papers or property she believed she had found on what was, until recently, essentially abandoned land might well belong to the trust by any reasonable legal accounting, given that Kessler's estate had passed to the bank's holdings in the absence of an heir, and suggesting, with a coldness that made his meaning unmistakable, that a woman in her circumstances would be wise not to make trouble for a man who held considerable influence over what remained of her prospects in this territory. Constance, who had spent 30 years learning the true measure of Hollow Pine's patience and now understood precisely how little of it Cyrus Bell deserved, told him only that she intended to see the truth reach the families it concerned, and that he was welcome to wait and discover what that truth revealed. It was not an idle warning on his part, for within the week a county surveyor arrived at the Icehouse, citing an obscure boundary dispute regarding the exact property line Prieger had sold her, suggesting her claim to the land might not survive careful legal scrutiny, and Constance understood this for second dispossession. It was clearly meant to be, dressed in the polite language of bureaucracy, She had no money for lawyers and no stand in the town sufficient to counter a respected banker's word with her own unsupported claim. But she had Kessler's ledger, growing testimony from Prieger and others willing to speak, once assured they would not stand alone, and conviction that the only way to protect the truth now was to make it too widely known and too well corroborated for any single man's influence to smother it again. She spent the following 2 weeks traveling by borrowed wagon to the scattered families Kessler's ledger named, finding among them a widow named Hesper Coyle, who had lost a modest freight business to a Bell foreclosure timed, with what now seemed unmistakable deliberation, just 3 days before contracted delivery would have paid the note in full, and a homesteading family named the Alvarezes who had lost 40 acres of bottomland to a foreclosure that occurred. Kessler's note suggested, only after Bell learned privately of a coming rail survey that would soon make that same land considerably more valuable. Together with these families' own gathered recollections and surviving paperwork, which corroborated Kessler's suspicions with an unsettling precision, Constance carried the ledger and the testimonies to a newspaper editor in the county seat of Larchmont, a careful man named Silas Dewar, who had built his small paper's reputation on exposing exactly the kind of quiet territorial corruption that boomtown boosters preferred kept silent, and who recognized immediately, upon examining the documents, the significance of what Constance had brought him. The account ran the following Sunday under a headline naming the pattern of foreclosures and the families it had harmed across a decade, and it did not take long for the story to reach every corner of Merrill County. The Territorial Banking Commission, unwilling to have its own years of oversight failure further exposed, launched a formal investigation into the trust foreclosure practices, and while the investigation would take months to fully resolve, its immediate effect was a swift and humiliating one for Cyrus Bell, who found himself suspended from the bank's management within a fortnight pending the inquiry's outcome. His reputation, built so carefully on an appearance of respectable efficiency, crumbling within a single difficult spring. Constance did not seek his ruin for its own sake, and she said so plainly to Hesper Coyle and the Alvarez family when they asked what she intended, telling them only that she wished to see the truth acknowledged and whatever restitution the law still allowed extended to those Bell's practices had harmed, and that the remainder was a matter for the Commission's own conscience rather than her private demand. The investigation ultimately found grounds to reverse or renegotiate several of the disputed foreclosures, including, in a quiet irony that did not escape the town's notice, a partial restoration of Constance's own original home, which the trust agreed to return to her at a fair valuation once its own irregular practices came under formal scrutiny. The gold coin Kessler had left buried in the ice, together with a portion of Constance's small Icehouse earnings that spring, went toward what became the true heart of her efforts that year, the full restoration of the old Icehouse itself, reopened not merely as a business, but as what Kessler himself had quietly meant it to become in his final years, a trusted place where struggling families could once again find fair credit and a patient hand. Its door open to anyone the territory's more established institutions had learned to overlook. By the following winter, the Icehouse that Hollow Pine had once mocked her for buying stood fully repaired, its roof sound, its walls once again holding a clean, honest cold to the harshest months, and the woman who owned it was no longer spoken of as Whitfield's ruined widow, but sought out by families across the county for her fairness, her memory for old debts of kindness, and a particular patient integrity that had once seemed, to a young girl riding beside her father on an ice sledge decade before, like nothing more than an old man's peculiar way of talking about a humble trade. The cold only forgives the patient, her father had told her, packing sawdust into an icehouse wall with his own bare hands, and Constance Whitfield, standing at last in the doorway of a building that had held 8 years of buried truth beneath its frozen floor, understood the full weight of those words at last. She had come to that Icehouse at 58 with $9 and no home, cast out by a debt she never knew she owed. She left that same year, not by moving away, but by becoming, finally and unmistakably, a woman the town could no longer afford to overlook, one who had taken to ruin everyone called worthless and found within its frozen heart the means to return a stolen fairness to the people who had waited a decade to reclaim it. We hope Constance's story reminded you, as it reminded us in telling, that value is so often hidden exactly where the world has stopped looking for it, and that patience, kept honestly across a lifetime, has its own quiet way of being repaid. If this story moved you, We would be grateful if you shared it with someone who understands what it means to be counted out too soon. And we would love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.